Hello and welcome to Smaulgld's next in the series of the CIA and gold as we analyze a number of recently declassified CIA and gold memorandum from the late 1960s, early 1970s, all the way through the 1980s. We've already covered the CIA gold memorandum from 1969, 1970, and 1971. Today we will be covering the 1972 CIA memorandum, the year after the United States went off the gold standard. Now, this is the first CIA document that we're going to look at that was not classified secret. This one was classified confidential. It does have some very interesting information in it nonetheless. It focuses on the decline of South African gold production and sales. It also talks about the Soviet Union increase in gold sales in 1972, but forgets or omits to mention the connection with grain prices and does not mention the Great Grain Robbery. We're going to talk about what the Great Grain Robbery was of 1972. Now, before we get started, if you enjoy the work that we're doing and you appreciate the CIA and Gold and the other series and updates that Smaulgld provides, please consider donating to Smaulgld via the links below at PayPal or via Bitcoin, or become a Patreon and contribute a small amount, a modest amount, or even a large amount each month. Thank you very much for those who have donated to Smaulgld. I appreciate that. And for those of you who will donate to Smaulgld. Also, let's get all the ads out of the way. I do not use Google AdSense. For those of you who wish to buy gold or silver, please consider doing so through the Smaulgld site. Smaulgld has affiliate relationships with SD Bullion, BGASC, Golden Eagle Coins, JM Bullion, Money Metals Exchange. You can compare pricing and shipping of gold and silver. And if you do buy through Smaulgld, the links below this podcast or on the Smaulgld website, you pay no more, no less than you would if you'd visited those sites directly, and Smaulgld makes a small commission. So it's not an investment advice to buy gold or silver, but if you are going to buy and you have made the decision to do so, please compare pricing and shipping at the Smaulgld site and make your purchases there. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into the state of the gold market in 1972 according to the CIA. As I mentioned, the prior documents we looked at were classified as secret, the 1969, 70, and 71 documents. And a classification as secret is just below top secret, which could cause grave damage. Now that's ahead of confidential, which would just damage national security if disclosed without proper authorization. The prior three documents we looked at, and by the way, if you want to see the prior three documents below this blog post, the links are there. Also, if you go to the YouTube channel, there is a playlist I've established for you called the CIA and Gold. You can see the prior three CIA and Gold podcasts. But the prior three CIA documents, memorandum from 1969 through 71, had a warning on them that this document contains information affecting the national defense of the United States. We're talking about the gold market here. That's how important it was when the U.S. was on a gold standard. The document we're going to analyze today, the world gold market in 1972 and prospects for 1973, was marked confidential. Still important, but would not cause grave damage if it had been released, but still would cause damage. So gold considered very important in the general scheme of things. Now, the U.S. abandoned the gold standard on August 15, 1971 under the Bretton Woods Agreement. Foreign central banks could exchange their dollars for gold at the U.S. Treasury. This memorandum is the first one after the U.S. went off the gold standard. Now, given that gold is no longer part of the monetary system, I suppose that's the reason for reducing the classification level from secret to confidential. So the memorandum talks about South African gold sales and production in 1972. In 1972 and in the early 70s, late 60s, South Africa was the prominent gold producing nation in the world. Some years produced up to 2/3 of the gold production in the world. So geopolitically, when the world was on a gold standard and South Africa was producing the bulk of the gold, South Africa was a very, very important country. Similar to, let's say, Saudi Arabia, when the petrodollar is the world's reserve currency, oil coming out of Saudi Arabia is also very important. To this day is very important. The production amounts out of Saudi Arabia and OPEC remain very important geopolitically. Back in early 70s, it was South Africa because the world ran on gold, settled its payments in gold, and was on a gold standard. So South African gold, well, they sold about 700 tons in 1972. Now, they had sold more in the prior year, 1,100 tons in 1971 and 1,420 tons in 1970. Things improved a bit for South Africa in their balance of payments, so they didn't have to sell as much gold in 1972 as they had in 1971. Now, Soviet Union also sold about 150 tons of gold worth about $300 million. And the CIA did note that the Soviet Union sold this gold to pay for grain purchases. What the CIA did not mention, at least in this document, was the Great Grain Robbery. Now, what was that? Well, that refers to the Soviet Union's purchase of large amounts of grain from the United States and other countries at low prices in 1972. In 1972, the Soviet Union had a crop failure, and it required them to purchase grain on the international markets. Well, when markets found out that the Soviet Union had purchased these large amounts from the United States and from other countries, grain prices absolutely skyrocketed. Now, ironically, the CIA should have been focused on international grain prices and inventories as a matter of national security rather than the gold market, because food is one way of controlling a population, and geopolitically, food is very important. In some respects, more important than finance, because you have to feed your population. Well, apparently, through these grain purchases, the international inventories were basically depleted. And the CIA projected that the Soviets would probably sell even more gold in 1973. And they also failed to mention that the reason they would do that was the U.S. signed a 3-year agreement in 1972 to sell its grain to the Soviet Union. And how is the Soviet Union going to pay for it? They were going to sell their gold. Also at the time, the Soviet Union was and still is a large producer of gold. The Soviet Union produced was, I think, about 150 tons of gold a year, about what they would sell. So currently, China is the #1 gold producer, followed by Australia, Russia, the United States. But again, back then it was the South Africans that had the bulk of the gold. But you see how back then the Soviets were a large producer of gold, and they're still currently a large producer of gold, but they're also a large buyer of gold, whereas back then they were selling their gold. Now, the CIA noted that the gold free market price reached a high of $70 an ounce before stabilizing around $64 an ounce. The good old days, right? Now, gold use in settling transactions slows to a crawl. The CIA noted that IMF gold transactions since the closing of the gold window had slowed to a trickle, and that the European community had agreed to dispense temporarily with gold settlements in official intra-EC monetary transactions. The reason I italicized temporarily is those were the words that Richard Nixon used in August of 1971 when he closed the window, the gold window. He said that he was closing the gold window temporarily and suspending the payment of gold in exchange for dollars when foreign banks brought them to the U.S. Treasury. So it's just an ironic note that the EC also used that concept that they would temporarily dispense of gold settlements in official intra-EC monetary transactions. They no longer would ever settle their transactions in gold. Now, gold production in 1972 fell from about 1,480 tons in 1971 to 1,450 tons. Put that into context. Today, gold production annually is about 2,800 to 3,000 tons, so about twice as much as it was back in 1971. The difference being that South Africa back then, in 1972, was 62% of the global gold production that year, and they produced about 900 tons. The Soviet Union produced about 270. That's about what they produce today, about 300 tons a year, but that was an increase back in 1972 of about 23%. Both countries are selling gold at the time in amount to meet their foreign exchange requirements. Russia, as we mentioned, was selling gold to buy wheat. And South Africa was selling, especially in 69, 70, 71, even in 72, to meet their cumulative foreign payment. And they had a big deficit, so they had to sell a lot of gold to cover the imports that were coming in. They were a bit lucky in 1972 because they had a good harvest and its agricultural exports were larger, so they didn't have to sell as much gold to meet their payment deficit. The CIA noted that sales of gold by South Africa and the Soviet Union were handled by a Swiss consortium, and the CIA noted that 75% of gold traded on the world markets was sold in Zurich, Switzerland, with the remainder being sold in London. If you remember from the prior podcast, the CIA suspected that the Swiss were manipulating the price of gold in 1969, 1970. They don't make any such references to manipulation here, and I suppose they were less interested in the gold manipulation because the idea of maintaining the gold price at $35 was less important now that the United States was off the gold standard. Gold demand in 1972, the higher price of gold in 1972, according to the CIA, discouraged gold hoarding for jewelry in the Far and Middle East. There's that word again, hoarding. And even back then, they called the people that lived in the Far East and the Middle East as traditional hoarders. Here's a very important point. Central banks and gold. Now, we know the gold standard was gone. It was not part of the international monetary system. We saw the EC had dispensed with with settling transactions intra-EC with gold. However, the CIA noted there was continued demand by some central banks for the U.S. to reopen the gold window. So they still kind of wanted that gold standard. And in February 1972, the U.S. devalued the dollar, and the official versus the free market price of gold was set at $38 an ounce. Now, despite all this, the CIA noted that gold's attraction as an official reserve asset had grown as the price had risen. So instead of being less interested in gold because the U.S. went off the gold standard, they became more interested in it because they went off the gold standard and the price had risen. Very important language, I have it bolded. National officials consequently have sought to keep their gold reserves intact in times of payment difficulties. The United Kingdom, for example, borrowed against its non-gold reserves during the summer run on sterling rather than risk a portion of its gold reserves to support the pound, highlighting that the UK would rather sell its gold as an absolute last emergency than to sell it just to support the sterling, which was the pound sterling at the time. An even better example was Italy threatened to drop out of the EC currency arrangement, which among other things called for a member state to repay its debts arising from central bank intervention in the same proportion as its reserves in gold, special drawing rights, and foreign currencies. Italy had a lot of gold and still has a lot of gold. If you remember from our top 10 gold countries chart, Italy's number 3 behind Germany and the United States. Well, because Italy had a lot of gold as a portion of the reserves, any debts that they owed under the EC currency arrangement, they would have to pay in proportion to the amount of gold they have, which would mean they'd have to pay a large percentage of their debts in gold. Well, Italy said, no way, no how. Non mi piace, we're not going to pay that way. We'd rather drop out of this EC currency arrangement right now. This is pre-Brexit, pre-Exit. This is 1972 when they were just starting to put together the EC and eventually the EU apparatus. This is pre-Euro. And Italy realized that it was more important for them to hold on to their gold than to be in this EC currency arrangement. Now, Italy did get special permission to repay its intervention obligations in dollars, which they had those. They'd rather pay in dollars than in gold. Thereby, they preserved its gold reserves, and then the EC also tentatively agreed to allow repayment in reserves other than gold by all members in 1973. So, you can see how the central banks at the time still wanted the gold. They were told it wasn't as important in the international monetary system. In fact, it's not part of the international monetary system, yet they clung to the idea they wanted to retain gold as a reserve asset. Price outlook for gold, 1973. The CIA projected that the free gold market prices might fall to about $58 an ounce in 1973. Reminder, if you want to see the other and or listen to the other CIA memos from 1970, 71, and 69, you can click on the links here, or you can go to the YouTube playlist. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.